She was 18 and had just been kicked out. No explanation, no goodbye, just a packed suitcase on the front step and a door that wouldn't open anymore. And with the last dollar she had, she bought a crumbling stone cottage on the west coast of Ireland, in a part of the country so remote that the nearest village was 5 miles away on foot. The roof was collapsing. The chimney was half fallen. The parish council said the building had been abandoned since the 1950s and wasn't worth restoring. But what nobody knew was that beneath the hearth of that old cottage, in a space that had been sealed since the Second World War, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Mira Okonkwo was born in Boston to Nigerian parents who had come to America in the 1990s hoping for a better life, and had, for a while, gotten one. Her father was a software engineer. Her mother was a nurse practitioner. They lived in a nice neighborhood in Brookline, sent Mira to a good public school, and raised her to be polite, hardworking, and quietly ambitious. Mira was an only child. She read constantly. She wrote poetry in a leather journal her grandmother had sent her from Lagos. She was the kind of student who sat in the back of the classroom and noticed everything without ever raising her hand. Her grandmother, whose name was Adaze, had been the most important person in Mira's early life. Adaze had visited from Nigeria every year during Mira's childhood, staying for a month at a time, filling the Brookline house with the smell of jollof rice and the sound of her laughter. She had taught Mira to braid her own hair, to cook egusi soup, and to pay attention to the shape of clouds before storms. She had given Mira the gold ring with the tiny turquoise stone that Mira wore on her right index finger, a ring Adaze had worn since her own wedding in 1962. "One day, this ring will travel somewhere you don't expect," Adaze had said when she gave it to Mira. "Rings know things." Adaze died when Mira was 14. She did not get to travel to Lagos for the funeral because her parents said it was too expensive and too disruptive to her school year. Mira had understood the reasoning, but it had broken something in her that never quite healed. She had kept the ring on her finger every day since. She touched it when she was nervous. She touched it when she was writing. She touched it when she needed to remember that somewhere in the world, someone had loved her without conditions. Her parents were not bad people. They were, in fact, good people by almost every measure. But they were also people who had worked extremely hard to build a specific kind of life, a stable, respectable, middle-class American life. And they could not understand any kind of ambition that did not involve building the same kind of life for yourself. They wanted Mira to become a doctor or a lawyer or at worst an engineer, something with a clear title and a clear income. They did not want her to become a writer, which is what she wanted, because being a writer was not a job, it was a hobby, and you couldn't feed a family with a hobby. The tension grew as Mira moved through high school. She kept her grades up because keeping her grades up was required to maintain the fragile peace in the Brookline house, but she spent all her free time writing. She filled notebook after notebook with poems and short stories and fragments of observation. She started publishing in her school's literary magazine. She won a small regional poetry contest when she was 16. Her parents read the published piece, told her it was nice, and then asked her about her plans to apply to pre-med programs. When she was 17, she applied, without telling her parents, to a prestigious writing program at a university in New England. She got in. When the acceptance letter arrived in the mail, her father opened it first, read it, and set it on the kitchen table without saying anything. Her mother read it next. Her parents sat in the kitchen for almost an hour having a conversation in Igbo that Mira only partially understood because she had never fully learned the language. That evening, they told her that she could not attend. They would not pay for it. Writing was not a career. They had not come to America for their daughter to waste her education on poetry. They said other things, too, things that were harder to hear, things that Mira would try to forget later but would not be able to. The conversation ended with her mother saying, "If you want to be a writer, you can be a writer somewhere else, not on our money, not in our house." Mira did not argue. She had learned long ago that arguing with her parents was like arguing with a brick wall. The wall does not move, and you only hurt your hands. She went to her room and wrote in her journal for 2 hours straight. She wrote about what she was feeling and what her grandmother would have said and what she was going to do next. She graduated from high school that June. 2 weeks later, on the morning of her 18th birthday, she came downstairs and found her suitcase packed and sitting by the front door. A handwritten note from her mother on top of the suitcase said, "Mira, we love you, but we cannot watch you make these choices. When you are ready to be serious about your life, you know where to find us." There was an envelope with the note. Inside the envelope was $300 in cash. Mira read the note. She read it again. Then she picked up the suitcase and the envelope and the small wheat-colored canvas tote bag her grandmother had given her, with her leather journal tucked inside. And she walked out the front door of the Brookline house and did not look back. She spent 3 days in a youth hostel in Boston trying to figure out what to do. The hostel cost $35 a night, which meant the $300 was disappearing fast. She applied for jobs. She called the writing program she had been accepted to and asked if there was any way she could still attend on financial aid alone. The admissions counselor was sympathetic but direct. Without her parents' cooperation on the FAFSA, she wouldn't qualify for enough aid. Not at that school. Not for a program that expensive. On the morning of the 4th day, Mira sat in the hostel common room with her laptop and her journal and a cup of bad coffee and tried to think. She had $180 left. She had no job, no school, no family she could call. She had a canvas bag full of notebooks and a gold ring with a turquoise stone. She had to make a decision, and the decision could not wait much longer because in 2 more days she would be out of money. She opened her laptop and did what she had been doing on and off for the past week. She searched for cheap places to live. Not in Boston, not in America. She had read once about a program in Ireland where rural properties were being sold by local councils for token amounts to encourage people to move to dying villages on the West Coast. Ireland had always fascinated her. Her grandmother had loved the poetry of Seamus Heaney. One of her grandmother's favorite books had been the letters of Edna O'Brien. Mira had been writing poems about Ireland for years, based on nothing but photographs and books and her grandmother's love of the country. She searched for rural property Ireland cheap cottage for sale. She scrolled through pages of results. Most of them were expensive by her standards, 20,000 or 30,000 euros for ruins that needed complete rebuilding. But on the 5th page of results, she found something different. It was a small listing on a County Mayo Council website. A crumbling stone cottage on a half-acre of land near a village called Achleum on the far northwestern coast of Ireland. The cottage had been abandoned since 1953. The current title holder was the parish council, which had acquired it through a lapsed inheritance decades ago. The council was offering it for €1 to anyone willing to commit to restoring it or preserving it as a site of cultural significance. There were conditions. The buyer had to be willing to live on the property or restore it within 5 years. The buyer had to register as a resident of the parish. The buyer had to respect the cultural and historical significance of the building. €1, about $1.10 in American money. Mira stared at the listing, a crumbling stone cottage in Ireland. A place so remote that the listing description included phrases like no vehicle access and footpath only, and water from well. A place that had been abandoned for over 70 years. She thought about her grandmother. Rings know things. She touched the turquoise ring on her right index finger. She had enough money for a plane ticket to Dublin if she flew standby. Barely. She had enough left over for 1 week of hostel stays. She had her journal. She had her laptop. She had the ring. She had to try. 2 days later, Mira was on a plane to Dublin. She landed at 6:30 in the morning, jet-lagged and nervous and running on 4 hours of hostel sleep, and took a bus from the airport to the train station and then a train to Westport, in County Mayo, on the west coast of Ireland. Westport was beautiful in the way that Irish towns are beautiful, colorful shop fronts, stone bridges, the sound of seagulls carried on the wind from the bay. She took another bus from Westport, a small local bus that ran twice a day out to the village of Achleum, where the cottage was listed. Achleum was not really a village. It was a few houses scattered along a coastal road, a small parish church, a pub called Mulligan's, and a post office the size of a closet. The land around it was the kind of land that Ireland is famous for: rolling green hills crossed with stone walls, sheep grazing in the distance, gray rocks pushing up through the grass, the wide blue-gray Atlantic stretching to the horizon. The air smelled like salt and heather and something sweet that Mira could not identify. She found the parish council office in a small building beside the church. The woman behind the desk was in her 60s, with curly gray hair and a thick Mayo accent and a framed photograph of the Virgin Mary on the wall behind her. Her name, she told Mira, was Bridget Malloy, and she had been clerk of the parish council for 22 years. Bridget looked at the listing Mira had printed out. She looked at Mira. She looked at the listing again. The old Gallagher cottage? I'm not sure of the name, ma'am. The listing said it was near Achleum. There's only one abandoned cottage in this parish that fits that description, pet. The Gallagher place. It's been empty since 1953. No one's been in it for decades. The council keeps listing it at €1 because the regulations require us to keep trying to find someone who will take it. Bridget paused, studying Mira. You came all the way from America? Yes, ma'am. For a ruin in County Mayo. Yes, ma'am. Bridget looked at her for a long moment. Then she smiled, very slightly. I've been doing this job for 22 years, and no one has ever come all the way from America for a Euro cottage. Most of the people who ask about these properties are English retirees or German investors. You don't look like either of those. She paused. Are you sure about this, pet? I need to ask. It's a hard place. The roof is mostly gone. The walls are crumbling. There's no electric in that part of the parish, or you'd need to run a line or go off-grid. The well is probably still good, but it would need to be tested. You'd be living far from anywhere. I'm sure, ma'am, I don't have anywhere else to go. Bridget set the printed listing down and studied Mira's face. Then she pulled out a form and a euro coin from her own purse and slid them across the desk. Don't worry about the euro today. I'll put it in the box for you. You keep your money for food. She began filling out the form. Welcome to County Mayo, Miss Okonkwo. The walk from the parish office to the Gallagher cottage was about 3 miles, along a narrow road that eventually turned into a grassy path between stone walls. Mira walked it slowly, her suitcase rolling behind her on the uneven ground. Sheep watched her from the fields. A small flock of magpies called from a blackthorn hedge. The wind came in from the Atlantic in steady, gentle gusts, carrying the sound of the distant waves. The cottage appeared over a rise in the land, and when Mira saw it, she stopped walking and just looked. It was smaller than she had imagined. About 25 feet long and 15 feet wide, a single rectangular building of rough-cut gray fieldstones with thick mortar between them, the mortar crumbling in places but the stones themselves straight and strong. The roof was slate, the original thick slate of West Ireland, patched with moss and missing tiles near the middle where a section had partially collapsed. A single tall stone chimney rose from the center of the cottage, one side of it fallen away to reveal the old clay flue inside. 2 small square windows flanked a heavy oak front door. The door hung slightly ajar on rusted iron hinges, held in place more by habit than by the hinges themselves. Around the cottage, the remains of what had once been a small garden. Wild roses had grown into thick, thorny masses along the south wall. Foxglove grew in spikes of purple and white. A sagging wooden gate leaned against a stone wall at the edge of what had been a path. And beyond the cottage, in every direction, the rolling green hills of West Ireland stretched away toward the sea. Mira stood on the path and looked at the cottage for a long time. It was hers. She had paid €1 for it, or rather, Bridget Malloy had paid it for her. and now this small, crumbling stone building on the western edge of a country she had never set foot in before was her legal property. She walked to the oak door and pushed it open. The hinges groaned but held. She stepped inside. The interior was a single room, exactly as she had expected, but also somehow not. The floor was flagstone, the same gray stone as the walls, covered in dust and small bits of fallen slate. The walls were the rough interior side of the same fieldstones that formed the exterior, uneven and textured and beautiful in their irregularity. The ceiling was open to the rafters, exposing the dark wooden beams that had held the slate roof in place for over 150 years. At one end of the single room was the hearth. The hearth was massive. It took up almost the entire north wall, an enormous stone fireplace big enough to stand inside, with an iron crane still hanging from a hook on the inner wall for holding cooking pots over the fire. The hearth stones were blackened by more than a century of cooking fires. Above the mantel, a rough wooden shelf had once held dishes or photographs, but now held only dust and a few fallen cobwebs. Mira walked toward the hearth slowly. The flagstone floor was uneven under her boots, and in front of the hearth, the flagstones were larger, a great flat hearthstone about 5 feet wide and 3 feet deep, set directly in front of the fire opening. The hearthstone was dark with decades of ash and soot, but beneath the grime, Mira could see that it was a single massive piece of gray stone, thick and heavy and ancient. She knelt in front of the hearth and put her palm flat on the hearthstone. The stone was cold. She sat like that for a while, just breathing, just letting herself understand that she was in a cottage on the west coast of Ireland, that she had come all this way alone with $180 in her pocket, that her grandmother had once told her the ring on her finger would travel somewhere she didn't expect. When she lifted her hand off the hearthstone, she noticed something. A small gap along the edge of the stone where it met the flagstone floor. Not a crack in the stone itself. A deliberate gap, as if the hearthstone was not fixed to the ground the way the other flagstones were. Mira leaned closer and brushed away decades of ash from the gap with her fingertips. The edge of the hearthstone was smooth. It had been cut to sit loose against the surrounding flagstones. She pressed down on one edge of the hearthstone. Nothing happened. She pressed down on the opposite edge. The stone rocked just slightly. It was not mortared in place. It was resting on something. Mira went out to the garden and found a short piece of iron that might once have been part of a fence post. She used it as a lever, wedging one end into the gap along the edge of the hearthstone, and leaning her weight on the other end. The hearthstone lifted slowly. It was incredibly heavy, probably 200 pounds or more, but the leverage of the iron bar was enough to tip it up on one edge. Underneath the hearthstone was a cavity. Not a natural gap in the flagstones, but a deliberately constructed chamber. A small rectangular space about 2 feet wide and 3 feet long and 2 feet deep, lined with flat stones on all sides. Inside the cavity was an oilcloth bundle wrapped and tied with heavy string. Mira eased the hearthstone back into place to keep from dropping it, and then reached into the cavity and lifted out the bundle. It was heavy. She carried it to the wooden shelf above the mantel and set it down carefully. The oilcloth was thick and dark with age, but intact. Mira untied the string and unfolded the bundle. Inside were 3 things: a small tin box with a hinged lid, a leather-bound ledger, and a wooden rosary. Mira opened the tin box first. Inside, wrapped in another layer of waxed paper, were small gold objects. Jewelry. Old jewelry, the kind with delicate filigree work and tiny stones. A pair of earrings set with garnets. A thin gold chain with a small cross pendant. A ring with a single blue stone. A gold locket on a chain, which Mira opened carefully with her fingernail. Inside was a tiny photograph of a young couple, a man with dark hair and a mustache, and a woman in a pale dress with flowers in her hair, both of them looking solemnly into the camera the way people did in old photographs. The ledger was the most interesting thing. Mira opened it carefully. The pages were thick paper, the writing in ink that had faded from black to a soft brown. The writing was in English, in a small, careful hand. The first entry was dated 1939. Mora Gallagher. My husband Declan and I are leaving Hacklam tonight. We are going to England to help with the war. Declan has joined up with the British Army. Foolish man that he is, but he says he cannot sit still while the world burns. I will work in a hospital in Birmingham. I do not know if we will come back. I am hiding this ledger and our savings and the few pieces of jewelry that have been in our families for generations beneath the hearthstone, where my grandmother used to hide things during the black and tan days. If we return, we will reclaim what is here. If we do not return, let this remain hidden until it is needed by whoever finds it. The hearth holds what the heart cannot carry. Beneath the first entry were more entries, updated irregularly through the war years. Mora had come back to the cottage once in 1942 when she had leave from her hospital work. She had added more money to the cavity and made a short entry. Declan is in North Africa. I pray every night. In 1944, she came back again and wrote, Declan is in France. I have not heard from him in 6 weeks, but they say this is normal now. In early 1945, she wrote, Declan is dead. Killed in Germany in March. I will go on. And then, in 1953, the last entry. I am leaving the cottage for the final time today. I am moving to America to live with my cousin in New York. I am 63 years old. There is nothing left for me in Hacklam. Declan is gone. Our parents are gone. The farm does not pay, and my hands are not strong enough for the work anymore. I am leaving everything beneath the hearthstone as I left it during the war. I do not have the heart to dig it up. The jewelry belonged to Declan's mother and grandmother. The money is what we saved before the war, plus my hospital wages during the war, plus what was left of Declan's army pension. I leave it for whoever finds this cottage next. Whoever you are, you will be a stranger to me, but not to this place. The cottage will know you if you deserve to stay. I hope it knows you well. Mora Gallagher, April 1953. Mira read the final entry twice. Then she set the ledger down very gently and lifted the rosary out of the oilcloth. It was made of simple, dark wooden beads with a small brass cross. She held it in her palm and felt the weight of it. Then she lifted the tin box and opened it again and looked at the jewelry. And then, carefully, she reached deeper into the oilcloth bundle and found a small cloth pouch she had not noticed before, tucked into the bottom. Inside the pouch was money. Old Irish punts and British pound notes from before the euro had come in, folded carefully and bundled with yarn. Mira counted the notes. There were bills going back to the 1940s, some of them worth far more as collector's items than their face value. Together, the money came to, she estimated, several thousand euros worth of currency if sold to a collector. Possibly more. If you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe. It helps us keep making stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, have you ever found an object that made you feel like you had been chosen by a stranger? Mira did not sleep in the cottage that first night. The roof was still too damaged to trust in the rain, and rain looked likely. She walked back to the village and took a room at Mulligan's pub, which had 2 rooms upstairs that it rented to travelers for 25 euros a night. She ate a plate of shepherd's pie in the pub's small dining room and wrote in her journal for 2 hours while the pub's regulars watched the news on a small television in the corner and occasionally glanced at her with the polite curiosity of people who did not see many strangers. The next morning, she went to a solicitor in Westport. Bridget had given her the name and showed her the jewelry and the ledger and the money. The solicitor, a thoughtful woman named Neve who specialized in rural property matters, went through everything carefully. She told Mira that under Irish law, the contents of a property belonged to whoever legally owned the property. Since Mira had legal title to the cottage, Everything Mora Gallagher had left there now legally belonged to Mira. There was no obligation to attempt to find Gallagher heirs, especially given that Mora had clearly written her intention that the items should go to whoever found them. But Mira wanted to try anyway, not out of legal obligation, but because it felt right. She asked the solicitor to help her research whether Mora Gallagher had any living descendants. Niev made a few calls. Over the next week, they learned that Mora had died in New York in 1978, with no children and no known surviving relatives. So the jewelry and the money were Mira's, legally and morally. She sold 2 pieces of the jewelry, the locket and the garnet earrings, to an antiques dealer in Galway for just over 11,000 euros. She sold the old currency to a numismatist in Dublin for 4,800 euros, the remaining pieces of jewelry she kept, including the ring with the blue stone, which she placed next to her grandmother's turquoise ring on a small chain around her neck. 2 rings from 2 women she had never met who had both loved her enough to leave her something. The money was enough to begin restoring the cottage. She hired a traditional stonemason from a nearby village, an older man named Padraig, who had been restoring old Irish cottages for 40 years. Padraig walked through the cottage on his first visit, ran his hands over the stone walls, tested the roof beams, and said, "She's sound, this one. The walls are perfect. The roof needs work, but the bones are there." He charged her a fair rate and agreed to teach her to do some of the work herself. The roof came first. Padraig and his son replaced the missing slates and repaired the damaged section, using slate they sourced from a reclamation yard in Connemara. The chimney needed rebuilding at the top. The fallen section had to be reconstructed stone by stone. Mira learned to hand mortar, mixing the traditional lime mortar that Padraig used and watching him lay the stones carefully, each one chosen for its shape and weight. The interior was mostly Mira's own work. She cleaned the flagstones by hand on her knees with a soft brush and a bucket of soapy water. She scrubbed the walls until the gray stone glowed. She cleaned the enormous hearth, brushing out decades of ash from the firebox. She ordered glass for the 2 windows from a glazier in Westport. She rebuilt the simple wooden shelves above the mantel and oiled them with linseed oil. She bought a small iron bed and a wooden table and 2 chairs from an estate sale in Castlebar. She hung curtains she sewed by hand from a bolt of natural linen. She kept the ledger and the rosary and Mora's photograph on the mantel above the hearth, the way Mora herself might have kept them once. She lit her first fire in the hearth in late August, using peat she bought from a neighbor named Sean who owned a small bog on the next farm over. The peat burned slowly with a steady, fragrant smoke, and filled the cottage with a warmth that made Mira understand, for the first time in her life, what the word home actually meant. She began writing again, really writing. The cottage was a good place for it. Quiet, simple, full of the kind of Atlantic light that poets have been trying to describe for centuries. She wrote in her leather journal in the mornings, sitting at the wooden table with a cup of tea, the fire burning low in the hearth beside her. She wrote about her grandmother. She wrote about her parents. She wrote about Mora Gallagher, whose life she had only glimpsed through a ledger and a tin of jewelry, but who had become, in her mind, a kind of second grandmother, a woman who had known loss and endurance, and the importance of leaving things for the next person who might need them. Within 6 months, she had written enough to submit to a small Irish literary magazine based in Galway. The magazine accepted 3 of her poems. They were her first published work. Within a year, she had published in 2 more magazines, and a small press in Dublin had expressed interest in seeing a collection of her poetry about Achliam and the cottage, and the woman who had built a life there before her. The neighbors, once they understood that Mira was staying, accepted her with the quiet, steady hospitality that rural Irish people are known for. Sean, who sold her peat, invited her to his family's Sunday dinners. Bridget Malloy from the parish council stopped by once a month with a casserole and updates on village news. An elderly widow named Roisin, who lived a mile down the road, began walking to the cottage on Saturday afternoons to have tea with Mira and tell her stories about the Aclium of her own childhood. Roisin had been a girl during the war and remembered Mora Gallagher. "A tall woman," Roisin said, "quiet like you. Loved that husband of hers like nothing I've ever seen. When he died in Germany, she was never the same." One evening, in late September, Mira sat on a stone bench outside the cottage door and watched the sun set over the Atlantic. The sky went from gold to rose to deep violet. The wind came in from the sea and smelled of salt and heather. The cottage behind her was warm, a fire burning low in the great hearth, a lamp in the window spilling soft amber light onto the stone path outside. Her grandmother's ring sat on her right index finger. Mora Gallagher's ring hung on a gold chain around her neck. Her journal was open on her lap, half full of a new poem she was writing. She thought about her grandmother, Adiz, who had given her a ring and told her that rings know things. Adiz had been right. The ring had traveled somewhere Mira had never expected, to the west coast of Ireland, to a cottage that had been waiting 70 years for someone who needed it. She thought about Mora Gallagher, whose husband had died in Germany in 1945 and who had left her savings beneath the hearthstone for whoever came next. Whoever came next. Mira had been a stranger to Mora, as Mora had written, but the cottage had known her. The cottage had held Mora's life patiently for 70 years, the way a hand holds something precious that is not its own. And when Mira had finally walked through the door and put her palm on the hearthstone, the cottage had decided she was the one it had been waiting for. She thought about her parents back in Brookline, whom she had not spoken to in 8 months. She did not miss them the way she had thought she would. She missed an idea of them, a version of them that had never quite existed, the version who would have been able to love her without trying to change her. The real people, the ones who had packed her suitcase and left it by the door, she did not miss. She understood now why Mora had gone to America in 1953, because sometimes leaving is the only way forward, and America had been for Mora what Ireland was now for Mira. A place to begin again. A place to write down what mattered and let everything else fade. That's the thing about the women who leave things behind for strangers. They are not strangers to the person they are leaving things for. They are family in the way that matters most, which is not the way of blood, but the way of recognition. Mora Gallagher had recognized something in the future, the possibility of another woman who would need what she had to offer, and she had trusted the cottage to hold her gifts until that woman arrived. The cottage had done its job. It had held the jewelry and the money and the ledger and the rosary for 70 years without complaint, and when Mira had finally walked through the door, the cottage had shown her where to look. The hearth holds what the heart cannot carry. Mora had written that line in her first ledger entry in 1939, and Mira had read it a dozen times since, and she was beginning to understand what it meant. Some feelings are too heavy to carry through a whole life. They have to be set down somewhere. A hearth is a good place to set them down, because a hearth is a place of warmth and rest, a place where people gather and where stories are told and where the dead are remembered. And what is set down in a hearth does not disappear. It waits. It waits for the next person who can lift it. Mira Okonkwo was 18 years old and kicked out. She had $1 to her name, and she spent it on a crumbling stone cottage on the west coast of Ireland. It was the best dollar she ever spent. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments, what has someone you never met left behind for you? We'd love to hear your story. See you in the next one.